kind of son becomes so successful that he starts feeling ashamed of the very woman who gave him life. And what happens when that woman is hiding a secret powerful enough to destroy everything he built in one of the most expensive penthouse offices overlooking a glittering skyline, where deals worth millions were signed with a handshake? Something far uglier was happening behind those glass walls, something no investor could see, but would have walked away from instantly if they had. Because standing quietly in the corner was an elderly woman in a simple, faded dress, her hands slightly trembling, her presence completely out of place in a room filled with luxury suits and polished confidence. And that woman was not a guest, not staff, but the mother of the CEO himself. Yet the way he looked at her, it wasn't love, it wasn't respect, it was pure irritation, almost like she was a stain on the perfect image he had created. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, he leaned closer to her and whispered something that would make anyone question what success really means. "I told you not to come here while my investors are around. Do you have any idea how this looks?" And for a second, she didn't respond, maybe hoping he would realize what he was saying, maybe hoping this was just stress talking. But no, he continued, colder this time, sharper. "You don't belong in this space. Just go back downstairs." And that word downstairs didn't mean comfort, didn't mean privacy. It meant isolation. It meant the part of the house no one talked about, the part where old things were kept out of sight. And yes, that's exactly where his own mother lived now, hidden away like something inconvenient. And if you're wondering how someone reaches this point, where a mother becomes an embarrassment, don't worry, it gets worse, because this wasn't the first time he had done something like this. Not even close. And as the room filled with quiet tension, he casually gestured toward security, not even looking at her anymore, as if she was already invisible. And within seconds, a guard approached her, not aggressively, but firmly enough to make it clear she wasn't welcome. And imagine that moment, being escorted out of your own son's office, not as a respected parent, but like someone who accidentally walked into the wrong place. And just as she turned to leave, trying to hold whatever dignity she had left, he said one more thing, something that didn't just hurt. It revealed everything about what he had become. "And don't forget to sign those papers I left for you. Just sign where marked. You wouldn't understand the rest anyway." And that line right there, it wasn't just disrespect. It was assumption. It was arrogance. It was him believing that she was too simple, too uneducated, too irrelevant to question anything. But what he didn't realize, what he completely overlooked in his obsession with image and control, was that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who understands everything. And as she slowly walked away, step by step, holding back tears that no one in that room cared to notice, one question starts forming in your mind. How does a relationship break to this extent, where sacrifice turns into shame and love turns into inconvenience? And more importantly, what exactly was in those papers he was so desperate for her to sign without reading? Because people don't rush signatures unless they have something to gain, and powerful people don't hide things unless there's something even more powerful at risk. And that's where the story begins to shift. Because while he thought this was just another day where he controlled everything, another moment where he could push her aside and move forward with his perfect life, that night was going to be different. That night, something would happen that he never planned for, something that would flip the entire power dynamic in a way he could never recover from. Because those simple papers he dismissed so casually were not simple at all, and the moment she decided to actually look at them instead of blindly trusting him was the moment his biggest mistake quietly began. Before the glass walls, before the expensive suits, before the world started calling him a genius CEO, there was only a small patch of land, harsh sun, and a woman who refused to break no matter how hard life tried to crush her. And if you think success stories are built in boardrooms, then you haven't seen what it takes to build one from the ground up. Because years ago, long before that humiliating moment in the office, she wasn't standing silently in a corner. She was standing in a field, her hands buried in soil, her back aching, her eyes tired but determined, and right beside her, in an old photograph, was a man who used to carry half that burden, her husband, a simple farmer with big dreams for his son. But life doesn't always follow the plan, and one unexpected day took him away, leaving her alone with a young boy and a future that suddenly felt impossible. And that boy, the same one who now couldn't stand her presence, once held her hand tightly, afraid of the dark, afraid of losing her too, but she didn't have the luxury to fall apart, because survival doesn't wait for grief to finish. So, while people around her suggested she sell everything, move away, start over in some small job, she chose the harder path. She chose to stay, to fight, to carry both roles, mother and father, even when her body screamed to stop, even when her hands cracked from endless work. Because every single day she had one goal in mind, her son's future. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because everything he has today, everything he shows off, every deal he signs, every luxury he enjoys, was built on sacrifices he no longer remembers, or worse, chooses to ignore. And it wasn't just about working harder. It was about giving up things that mattered, selling pieces of their life one by one, just to keep him moving forward. And there was a moment, a quiet but painful moment, when she had to let go of something that held memories, something her husband had worked for years to build, just to pay for her son's education. And she didn't cry in front of anyone. She didn't complain. She simply made sure the fees were paid on time. The books were ready. The opportunity was never missed. And back then, he wasn't this cold, distant man. Back then, he would hug her, promise her things, tell her that one day he would change everything for her, that she wouldn't have to struggle anymore. And maybe he believed it at the time. Maybe somewhere along the way, success didn't just change his lifestyle. It changed him, slowly, quietly, until the boy who once feared losing his mother became the man who feared being associated with her. And if that doesn't make you pause for a second and think, then ask yourself this: how often do people forget the very hands that lifted them when they had nothing? And while all of this was happening in the past, in the present, something even more dangerous was unfolding, because that same woman who worked through pain, who learned through observation, who refused to stay limited by what others thought she knew, had spent years doing something no one noticed, something that now mattered more than ever. She had been learning, quietly, patiently, reading whatever she could, even if it meant going through her son's old books late at night, understanding things step by step, not for recognition, not for power, but simply because she refused to remain dependent forever. And that's the part he underestimated the most, because when he told her to just sign those papers without thinking, he assumed she wouldn't question anything. He assumed she was still that same woman who only knew the fields and nothing else. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't even imagine, was that the moment she sat down alone that night, in that cold, forgotten space he had pushed her into, holding those papers in her hands, her eyes didn't skip the lines. They followed them carefully, slowly. And as she began to understand what was written, as each word revealed more than the last, something inside her shifted, not just hurt, not just disappointment, but realization. Because this wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This wasn't just about being ignored or hidden away. This was something much deeper, something calculated, something that made one thing painfully clear. Her son wasn't just ashamed of her. He was trying to take something from her, something she didn't even know she had. And the moment that truth settled in, the moment everything connected, was the moment the story stopped being about a helpless mother and started becoming something far more dangerous. Because when a person who has sacrificed everything realizes they've been betrayed, they don't react the way you expect. And what she decided to do next was something he would never see coming. What if the person you thought was the weakest in your life was actually the one holding the most power over you, and you just never bothered to notice it. That night, in a room no one cared about, sitting on a small, uncomfortable bed, surrounded by things that had been forgotten, just like her, she held those papers again. But this time not with confusion, with focus, because once you start seeing the truth, you can't unsee it. And line by line, word by word, something unbelievable started to unfold. Something that didn't just shock her. It completely changed the way she saw everything around her, because those weren't just legal documents. They weren't routine approvals or harmless signatures. They were ownership papers, control agreements, the very foundation of the company her son was so proud of. And as she read deeper, one number stood out so clearly that it almost didn't feel real. 60%, not 10, not 20, but 60% of the company's original ownership was in her name. And for a moment, everything went silent, because, think about it, the same woman who was being told to hide in a basement, the same woman who was treated like she didn't belong in a room full of executives, was actually the majority owner of the entire empire, and the man calling himself the CEO, the one giving orders, the one controlling everything, only held 40%. And suddenly all his urgency, all his pressure to just sign here without questions, all his dismissive confidence, it all started making sense. Because this wasn't about convenience. This wasn't about simplifying paperwork. This was about control. This was about quietly removing her from the equation before anyone realized what she truly had. And here's the part that changes everything. He thought she would never understand any of this. He thought she would glance at the papers, feel overwhelmed, and blindly trust him like she always had. But he forgot something critical. People who survive hardship don't stay unaware forever. They adapt, they learn, they observe, and sometimes they become far more capable than anyone gives them credit for. And as she sat there, absorbing the weight of this truth, one question started forming, not out of anger, but out of clarity. If he was willing to go this far, to manipulate his own mother for power, then what else was he capable of? And more importantly, what should she do now? Because this wasn't just about exposing him. This wasn't just about confronting him in anger. This was about making a decision that would define everything that came next. And here's where the story takes a turn most people wouldn't expect. Because instead of reacting emotionally, instead of storming upstairs or calling him out immediately, she did something far more controlled, far more dangerous. She stayed silent, but not the kind of silence he was used to, not the silence of helplessness. This was the silence of someone who had just gained awareness, someone who was thinking, planning, calculating, And early the next morning, before the house even fully woke up, before the same routine of disrespect could begin again, she made a call, not to family, not to friends who would offer sympathy, but to someone who understood power, someone who understood the law, someone who could turn knowledge into action. And when they met, away from the luxury, away from the image her son was so obsessed with maintaining, she placed those documents on the table without saying much, because sometimes you don't need to explain everything. The truth speaks for itself. And as he read through the papers, as his expression slowly shifted from curiosity to realization, even he couldn't hide the reaction, because what she held in her hands wasn't just important, it was decisive. It was control at the highest level. And when he finally looked up at her, there was no doubt left, no confusion, just one clear statement that changed the entire direction of this story. You're not just connected to this company, you own it. And in that moment, everything flipped, not publicly, not visibly, but internally, because the person who was being pushed aside, the one who was expected to stay quiet and invisible, now understood something the main player in this entire game had completely overlooked. And instead of fear, instead of hesitation, something else started to settle in: confidence. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, controlled. And when someone reaches that point, when they stop reacting and start deciding, that's when things become unpredictable. And as the day moved forward, as her son continued preparing for what he believed would be one of the biggest moments of his career, a deal that would take his company to another level, he had no idea that the real decision maker wasn't in that boardroom yet. Because by the time he would see her again, it wouldn't be the same woman he dismissed, and the move she had already set into motion wouldn't just challenge him. It would dismantle everything he thought he controlled. What happens when the person you tried to erase walks back into your world at the exact moment you need control the most? And suddenly, everything you built starts slipping out of your hands without warning. That afternoon, the same office that once felt like a symbol of power, precision, and perfection was filled with anticipation. Because this wasn't just another meeting. This was the deal. The kind of deal that defines careers, the kind that turns success into legacy. And he was ready, confident, composed, completely unaware that confidence without awareness can become the biggest weakness. Because while he was preparing numbers, projections, and rehearsed pitches, something far more important was missing: certainty. The kind that comes from knowing you truly own what you're presenting. And as the room filled with important faces, sharp minds, and quiet judgments, everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. Until it wasn't. Because just as he began speaking, just as he started laying out his vision with that same authority he had used to control every situation before. The doors opened, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to shift attention. And in that subtle moment, the energy in the room changed, because the person who walked in wasn't expected, wasn't invited, and definitely wasn't someone he wanted anyone to notice. Yet there she was, not standing in a corner this time, not waiting to be ignored, but walking forward with a calm that didn't match the version of her he had created in his mind. And for a split second, confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by irritation. Because in his world, this wasn't just an interruption. It was a threat to his image. And without thinking, he reacted the only way he knew how, with authority, with dismissal, signaling for her to be removed, just like before, as if repeating the same action would produce the same result. But here's where everything started to break, because this time, nothing moved the way he expected. The same authority that once worked instantly met resistance, not from her, but from the reality he had ignored, because before anyone could take a step, before the situation could be controlled again, something was presented that changed the entire atmosphere. Something simple, yet powerful enough to stop everything in its tracks. And in that moment, the conversation was no longer about deals or investments. It was about ownership, about truth, about something he thought had already been handled quietly. And as the realization began to spread across the room, not through loud announcements, but through silent understanding, you could almost feel the shift, because people who were there to invest weren't just looking at numbers anymore. They were looking at him differently, questioning, reassessing, connecting dots he didn't even know existed. And that's the thing about hidden truths. Once they surface, they don't just expose facts, they expose character. And suddenly, the man who had spent years building an image of control was standing in a situation he couldn't control at all, because the very person he had dismissed, the one he believed wouldn't understand anything, was now at the center of the conversation without even raising her voice. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't aggressive, it was clear, measured, and far more powerful than anything he had said that day. Because she didn't need to argue. She didn't need to prove anything. The truth was already doing that for her. And in that moment, something irreversible happened, because control didn't shift slowly, it shifted completely. And the deal he thought was secured, the future he thought was guaranteed, started collapsing, not because of competition, not because of market conditions, but because of a decision he made in arrogance, believing he could manipulate someone who had spent a lifetime surviving far worse than his tactics. And as the room grew quieter, heavier, filled with a tension that no one wanted to break first. One thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just a disruption. This was a turning point. The kind that doesn't just affect a moment, but rewrites everything that comes after. And the most dangerous part for him wasn't losing control in that room. It was realizing that the consequences of his actions were only just beginning, because losing authority in front of others is one thing, but facing the full impact of what you've done when there's nothing left to hide, that's something else entirely. And as everything he built started slipping further away with each passing second, one question remained. If this was the moment his empire began to fall, what would be left of him when it was over? What does a person lose first when everything falls apart? The money, the power, or the illusion they built about themselves? And what happens when the only person who could have saved them chooses silence instead? Because what followed that moment in the boardroom wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't even immediate. And that's what made it more devastating, because real consequences don't always explode. Sometimes they quietly take everything away piece by piece until there's nothing left to hold on to. And for someone who was used to control, used to being respected, used to walking into rooms and being the center of attention, the shift was almost unreal. Because suddenly, the same people who once listened carefully began to distance themselves. Conversations became shorter, opportunities started disappearing, and the confidence he once carried so effortlessly began to crack under a pressure he didn't understand how to handle. And if you think losing a position is the hardest part, then you haven't seen what it does to someone when their identity is built entirely on that position. Because without it, without the title, without the authority, he wasn't just a different version of himself. He was someone he didn't even recognize anymore. And the life that once looked perfect from the outside started collapsing in ways he never imagined, because the house that symbolized success wasn't sustainable without the image that supported it. The lifestyle that depended on constant growth couldn't survive a sudden stop. And slowly, quietly, everything began to disappear, not all at once, but enough for him to feel it every single day. And here's where it becomes even more real. Because the people who stay when things are easy aren't always the ones who stay when things get hard, and the same partnership that once looked unbreakable started showing its true nature. Because when the foundation shifts, so do the people standing on it. And in a matter of time, the life he had built around himself didn't just shrink, it changed completely, leaving him in a place he never thought he would return to. A place where effort mattered more than image, where results didn't come from authority, but from work. And for the first time in a long time, he had to face something he had avoided for years: reality. Not the version he created, not the version he presented, but the one he ignored. And in that reality, one thing became impossible to escape: the truth of what he had done. Not just the mistake, but the intention behind it. Because it's one thing to fail, it's another to realize that your own actions caused that failure. And when that realization finally settles in, when there's no one left to blame, no situation left to twist, no image left to protect, that's when the real consequences begin. Not outside, but inside. And while all of this was happening, while his world was shrinking, while he was trying to make sense of everything he had lost, somewhere far from all that noise, far from the pressure, far from the constant need to prove something, there was a different kind of life unfolding. A quieter one, a simpler one, but one that didn't depend on validation or status, because she had returned to a place that never required her to be anything other than who she was, a place where effort still meant something, where the air didn't carry judgment, and where peace wasn't something you had to earn through success. And the contrast between these two realities, that's where the story truly completes itself, because one person lost everything chasing an image, and the other found everything by letting go of it. And if you're wondering whether he ever reached out, whether he tried to fix things, whether he realized what he had done, the answer is yes, more than once, because regret doesn't stay quiet forever. It pushes, it reminds, it forces you to face moments you wish you could undo. But here's the part that most people don't expect. Not every apology gets a response. Not every realization leads to reconciliation. Because sometimes the most powerful answer isn't anger, isn't revenge, it's silence. The kind that doesn't need to explain anything. The kind that simply shows that some lines, once crossed, don't get redrawn. And that silence became his reality. Not for a moment, not for a phase, but long enough for him to understand something he had ignored for far too long. That success isn't measured by what you build, but by what you choose not to destroy while building it. And if there's one thing this story leaves behind, one thought that stays with you even after everything ends, it's this: when you start seeing the people who raised you as obstacles instead of foundations, you're not moving forward, you're already losing. You just don't realize it yet.